They lived without showers. They bathed in rivers. And they didn't even have soap. Yet somehow, medieval people weren't walking diseases. Or were they? What if everything you thought you knew about hygiene in the Middle Ages is wrong? What if their ways, though primitive, were rooted in logic, belief, and survival? This is not just a story about dirt and disease. It's about culture, religion, fear, and how an entire civilization kept itself clean without the modern comforts we take for granted. For centuries, popular culture has painted medieval Europe as a cesspool of filth-mud-covered peasants trudging through waste-lined streets, unwashed nobles reeking under layers of velvet, and a population blissfully unaware of personal hygiene. But this image, though widespread, is largely a myth, a distortion shaped by later biases, Enlightenment-era propaganda, and Victorian morality. The truth is more complex. While it's accurate that sanitation in the Middle Ages was far from modern standards, it's wrong to assume medieval people were indifferent to cleanliness. In fact, many medieval communities had surprisingly structured routines for washing, bathing, and maintaining both personal and public hygiene. These practices varied across time and region, shaped by religion, local customs, climate, and class. The misconception likely stems from the post-medieval era. Writers during the Renaissance and Enlightenment often portrayed the Middle Ages as dark and backward to elevate their own era's supposed superiority. Victorian scholars, too, had a tendency to judge medieval hygiene through their own sanitized lenses, ironically, at a time when London's Thames was full of raw sewage. What they missed were the documented efforts medieval people made to stay clean. Records from monasteries, for instance, reveal detailed rules about washing hands before meals and bathing at regular intervals. Monks were often required to bathe several times a year, sometimes more often, depending on the order. Public bathhouses were common in cities from Paris to Prague during the 12th and 13th centuries. These were not just for the wealthy. Merchants, tradesmen, and even laborers frequented them. Soap-like substances made from animal fat and wood, as though harsh, were used to scrub both clothes and bodies. Personal grooming mattered, too. Hair and beard care were part of daily life for many, as were changing linen, underclothes, which absorbed sweat and were washed far more regularly than outer garments. A clean appearance was tied to status and self-respect. Even if it didn't conform to modern definitions of hygiene, the streets themselves were not always the disease-ridden hellscapes often imagined. Many towns had rules requiring residents to keep the area in front of their homes clean. Some cities even employed public sanitation officers, early versions of municipal workers who enforced these standards. Yet, it's also true that waste management was crude by today's standards. Chamber pots were emptied into streets or rivers. An understanding of germs or infection was non-existent. During periods of war, famine, or plague, hygiene practices collapsed. But this wasn't due to ignorance. It was often a result of social breakdown and sheer survival pressure. So, while medieval hygiene lacked modern polish, the people of that era were not blindly wallowing in their own dirt. They had systems, they had tools, and they had a cultural framework that within the limits of their knowledge valued cleanliness. The story is not one of filth, but of adaptation. Not of ignorance, but of different priorities shaped by the world they lived in. In the medieval world, cleanliness was not just about health. It was tied to the soul. Religious teachings, particularly in Christianity and Islam, wove hygiene into daily life. Both faiths emerged from regions where water was precious and ritual purification had ancient roots. As they spread across continents, they carried with them a framework that treated washing not merely as a practical concern, but as a moral obligation. In the Islamic world, hygiene held legal and spiritual weight. The Quran and Hadiths laid out detailed instructions on personal cleanliness. Ritual ablution, or wudu, was required before the 5 daily prayers. It involved washing the hands, mouth, nose, face, arms, head, and feet using clean water with a clear order and intention. For situations involving sexual activity, menstruation, or bodily impurity, a full-body purification called ghusl was mandatory. This wasn't symbolic. It was expected, enforced, and considered a prerequisite for spiritual readiness. These practices shaped urban life across the Islamic world. By the 10th century, cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba boasted public bathhouses known as hammams. These were not luxury retreats, they were public institutions, often subsidized by religious endowments, accessible to common people. Bathing was communal, gender-segregated, and structured. A hot room for sweating, a warm room for washing, a cold room for cooling down. The hammam served a practical function, but it was also spiritual. Entering clean was required before entering a mosque. Cleanliness was seen as half of faith. In medieval Christian Europe, the relationship between religion and hygiene took a more complex path. Early Christianity inherited Roman bathing culture, and in the early Middle Ages, monasteries became centers of cleanliness. The Rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, prescribed regular bathing for monks, particularly when sick or traveling. Monastic compounds often included latrines, connected to running water and designated spaces for washing. Medieval monasteries across the continent, from Cluny in France to Westminster Abbey in England, built sophisticated water systems. Cisterns collected rainwater. Underground channels diverted clean water into cloisters. The act of washing hands before meals, of shaving heads and trimming beards, became codified into monastic life. Cleanliness was associated with discipline, not vanity. Yet, by the late Middle Ages, theological attitudes toward the body had shifted. As fears of sin and corruption grew, nudity then in bathhouses came under suspicion. Church authorities began discouraging public bathing, linking it with lust and moral decay. Bathhouses in Christian Europe didn't disappear, but they were increasingly monitored or closed, especially during times of plague or moral panic. Still, remnants of spiritual hygiene persisted. Pilgrims traveling to holy sites like Santiago de Compostela often washed in sacred springs before entering the sanctuaries. Holy water at the entrance of churches symbolized both physical and spiritual cleansing. The connection between body and soul was never fully severed. In both religions, cleanliness reflected something deeper. It was an external expression of internal discipline, a visible sign of invisible faith. And in a world where disease, impurity, and sin were often seen as interlinked, water used in the right way, in the right order, offered not just sanitation, but salvation. By the 12th century, public bathhouses were woven into the urban life of medieval Europe. Far from being rare or scandalous, they were common features in cities like Paris, London, Nuremberg, and Prague. Known in German as Badstuben and in French as etus, these spaces were not just places to wash, they were social institutions. Steam rooms, hot water baths, and body scrubs created a medieval equivalent of the modern spa, and for a few hundred years they flourished. The typical bathhouse featured several rooms, a waiting area, a changing room, a hot air or steam chamber, and a main bathing space filled with large wooden tubs. Water was heated in cauldrons and poured into the tubs. Herbs such as lavender or chamomile were often added, not for relaxation, but to ward off disease and mask odor. Patrons were scrubbed down with rough cloths or special brushes, then rinsed with clean water. In some cases, servants were hired to assist with the process, including applying scented oils or massaging limbs. Bathing was affordable. Many bathhouses offered rates accessible to artisans and laborers, not just the wealthy. In cities like Frankfurt or Bruges, records show bathhouse visits were part of the regular weekly routine for both men and women. The 14th century physician Heinrich von Mondeville recommended bathing for good health. Municipal authorities in several cities even encouraged cleanliness as a civic virtue. Gender segregation varied by time and place. In some regions, men and women bathed separately, either on alternating days or in different sections of the facility. But in many parts of Central and Western Europe, especially during the height of bathhouse culture, mixed bathing was common at least until the late 14th century. Contemporary illustrations, including from German and Flemish manuscripts, depict scenes of men and women sharing baths, sometimes nude, sometimes wrapped in cloth. This mingling blurred the line between hygiene and leisure. Food and drink were often served in the bathhouse. It was not unusual to see musicians performing or couples relaxing together in tubs. For many, it was less about sanitation and more about social interaction. Bathhouses became places where business was conducted, gossip exchanged, and romantic encounters arranged. Some establishments were eventually associated with prostitution, which would later contribute to their decline. The downfall of the bathhouse was not sudden, but it was decisive. Several factors converged in the late 14th and 15th centuries. One was the growing influence of church moralists, who condemned mixed bathing and the perceived licentious behavior inside these establishments. But the more immediate blow came from disease. The Black Death, beginning in 1347, changed everything. As plague ravaged Europe, public spaces that involved shared water and close bodily contact were increasingly seen as dangerous. Some believed that heat opened the pores and allowed miasma's bad air thought to carry disease to enter the body. Bathing, once considered healthy, became suspect. By the 16th century, many bathhouses were closed or repurposed. In Protestant regions, public morality codes often banned them outright. In Catholic regions, tighter regulations and changing medical theories reduced their appeal. The decline of the bathhouse did not signal an end to bathing entirely, but it marked a cultural shift from communal washing to private, more infrequent cleansing. For nearly 3 centuries, bathhouses had served as a cornerstone of urban life in medieval Europe. Their disappearance wasn't just about hygiene. It was about fear, morality, and a changing world in medieval Europe. Access to clean water was not automatic. It was a daily effort shaped by geography, class, and communal infrastructure. For most people, water didn't come from a tap. It came from wells, rivers, springs, or barrels set beneath thatched roofs to catch rain. Each source had its own risks, routines, and uses. In villages, the central well was a lifeline, dug by hand, lined with stone, and covered to prevent contamination. These wells served as communal gathering points. Women and children often fetched water each morning, carrying it back in wooden buckets or ceramic jugs. The labor was repetitive, but necessary. In towns and cities, wealthier households sometimes had private wells or access to aqueduct-fed fountains. But for the majority, public wells were the norm. Rivers and streams played a dual role, source of water and place of disposal. People bathed in them, washed clothes along their banks, and used them for cooking and brewing. But they were also where butchers dumped animal waste, tanners discarded chemicals, and households emptied chamber pots. This contamination wasn't always understood, but it was noticed. In some towns, laws banned washing clothes upstream of where water was drawn for drinking. In others, fines were imposed for dumping refuse near public collection points. For households without wells nearby, rainwater was a critical supplement. Barrels were placed under eaves to catch runoff. In dry seasons, this water was sometimes rationed or reserved for washing rather than drinking. In monastic communities and wealthier urban homes, cisterns were built to store larger quantities of rainwater, often used for both domestic cleaning and ritual purification. Washing the body was not a daily act for most, but it wasn't ignored. Hands and face were commonly washed in the morning and before meals. The feet, considered especially unclean due to outdoor travel, were washed at night. And in monasteries, foot washing was part of religious practice. Full-body bathing was more occasional, tied to available water, time, and weather. In colder months, it might happen once every few weeks. In warmer climates, or during summer, it was more frequent. Clothes, particularly linen undergarments, were washed far more often than the body. Linen absorbed sweat and body oils, and people understood that changing into clean garments reduced odor. Washing was usually done at communal spots, riversides, washhouses, or dedicated areas with wooden troughs. Ashes from the hearth were used to make lye, a rudimentary but effective cleaning agent. Garments were scrubbed, rinsed, then laid out to dry in fields or on hedges. Washing before church was customary in many regions, especially on Sundays and feast days. Clean hands and a clean face were a mark of respect before entering a sacred space. In some households, this was extended to combing hair and wearing freshly laundered clothes, even if they were worn only once a week. Cleanliness, while limited by means, was part of religious observance and communal expectation. Water shaped every level of medieval hygiene. It was heavy, hard to carry, and not always clean, but it was central to how people lived, washed, and understood what it meant to be presentable, respectable, or spiritually prepared. Before commercial soap became widespread, medieval people turned to a range of natural substances to stay clean. These weren't luxury items. They were household materials, rough, basic, and sometimes unpleasant. But they worked. One of the most common substitutes was wood ash. When mixed with water, ash from burned hardwoods produces lye, an alkaline solution capable of breaking down fats and grease. People used it not only to clean cooking pots and utensils, but also to wash clothes and scrub their bodies. Lye is caustic. In stronger concentrations, it can burn the skin. But when diluted, it served as an early detergent. It was especially common in rural areas, where ash from the hearth was always available. Sand was another widely used abrasive in coastal communities and along riverbanks. It served as a practical mixed with water or oil. Sand could remove dirt from hands and feet after work. It didn't kill bacteria, but it reduced grime and made the skin feel cleaner. Farmers, tanners, and smiths often used it at the end of the day before eating. In Northern and Eastern Europe, fermented urine had a specific, if unpleasant, role in a source of ammonia. Aged urine was known to help remove stains and soften fabric. It was collected in containers and left to sit sometimes for weeks until it reached the desired chemical strength. In the cloth industry, fullers used it to cleanse wool and prepare cloth for dyeing. Though the practice may seem shocking today, it was normalized and even taxed in some places. The Romans had taxed urine collection centuries earlier. Medieval societies simply continued the method. Herbs and aromatic plants were also part of washing routines, especially for wealthier households. Rosemary, sage, lavender, and thyme were steeped in hot water to create fragrant rinses. Some acted as mild antiseptics, others simply masked odor. These mixtures were used to wash hair, cleanse minor wounds, or freshen hands and feet. In monastic infirmaries, herbs were sometimes mixed with vinegar for antiseptic cleansing. The Church had inherited these techniques from earlier Roman and Byzantine medicinal practices. In parts of the Islamic world and in southern Europe, where olive oil was abundant, mixtures of oil and ash were used to create basic soap-like pastes. Aleppo in Syria became known for its olive oil and laurel berry soap as early as the 8th century. These hard soaps spread into Mediterranean trade networks and, over time, made their way into European markets. But for much of the medieval period, true soap remained expensive and localized. For common people, cleaning meant improvisation. It meant using what was available, strong-smelling, gritty, or even caustic. There were no factory-produced bars or bottles. There was only ash, sand, and skill passed down through generations. Cleanliness wasn't about comfort, it was about function. A routine act rooted in necessity, not luxury. In medieval Europe, the scent of a person carried meaning far beyond hygiene. It signaled status, wealth, and identity. Cleanliness was not just physical, it was social. For the upper classes, managing body odor was part of a broader performance of refinement. The wealthy could afford what the poor could not. Multiple sets of clean linen, imported perfumes, and access to private baths. Linen undergarments were critical. These layers, worn closest to the body, absorbed sweat and oils, while full-body bathing remained occasional even among elites. Changing into fresh linen was common and visible. A crisp, white chemise or shirt suggested not just cleanliness, but control, discipline, and civility. Perfumes played a significant role. Extracted from herbs, flowers, and spices, they were distilled into oils or waters and applied to clothing, hair, or skin. Rosewater, made by steeping petals in boiling water, was particularly popular in both Islamic and Christian courts. Musk, ambergris, and civet imported from Asia and Africa were rarer and more expensive. In France and Italy, nobles carried pomanders, small, perforated bowls filled with scented resins, or wore sachets sewn into their garments to mask unpleasant smells. These scents weren't just cosmetic. They reflected trade wealth and global connections. Among the lower classes, body odor was harder to avoid and often tolerated. Physical labor, limited access to water, and shared living spaces meant that sweat and grime accumulated. But even among peasants, there was awareness of smell as a social signal. Clean hands, a washed face, and freshly laundered clothes on Sundays, especially before church, were signs of respectability. Over time, odor itself became linked to morality. By the late Middle Ages, A clean scent implied not only wealth, but also virtue. Theologians and physicians alike warned that foul smells indicated internal corruption or even sin. The poor were often described not just as dirty, but as stinking, marking them as physically and spiritually suspect. In courts and royal households, regulations about hygiene were formalized. Servants were expected to wash and present themselves in clean clothing. In the court of Louis IX of France, who reigned from 1226 to 1270, even knights were criticized for neglecting nobility, increasingly conscious of public image, embraced scented oils and elaborate grooming not only to attract admiration, but to distinguish themselves from those beneath them. Cleanliness in the medieval world was not democratic. It was curated. Smell became a subtle but powerful language of class. In the medieval world, medicine was grounded in balance specifically. The balance of 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. This ancient theory, inherited from Hippocrates and Galen, shaped every aspect of medical thinking. In Europe for centuries, health meant equilibrium. Illness meant disorder. And within this system, cleanliness was more than comforted, was protection. Physicians believed that external factors like air, temperature, and smell could disturb the humors inside the body. The theory of miasma, bad air, became central to this understanding. Foul odors, especially those from rot, waste, or unwashed bodies, were thought to carry disease. The stench wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. Smelling decay could, in theory, corrupt the blood or disrupt the humors, triggering fevers, plagues, or worse, hospitals, such as the Hôtel-Dieu in Paris or the Hospital of Santa Maria Nuova in Florence, were designed with airflow in mind. Windows were placed to allow circulation, and herbs were burned to mask or purify the air. In private homes and monasteries, floors were sometimes strewn with rushes mixed with lavender, rosemary, or mint knot for decoration, but to ward off foul air. Physicians advised patients to avoid strong smells and to wash regularly, not to kill germs. A concept still unknown, but to remove the filth that could attract corrupted air. Bathing was often recommended as a way to open the pores, allowing the body to release harmful substances. But it came with caution, because open pores were seen as vulnerable to miasmas. Timing mattered. Bathing in the wrong season, or under the wrong planetary alignment, could expose a person to illness. This belief grew stronger in times of epidemic. During the Black Death in the mid-14th century, many people avoided baths altogether, fearing that wet skin would allow plague-bearing air to seep in. Medical texts from the era reflect these anxieties. The Regimen Sanitatis Salernatinum, a widely circulated guide from the medical school of Salerno, advised moderation in all things: diet, sleep, exercise, and washing. It promoted cleanliness, but warned against excess. Physicians like Guy de Chauliac, who treated patients during the plague in Avignon, wrote extensively about bad air as a cause of disease and described how vinegar, fire, or aromatic herbs could be used to purify a room. Cleanliness was thus tightly woven into survival strategies. To wash the hands before meals, to rinse the face after travel, to air out clothing, these were not acts of vanity. They were medical precautions, grounded in the science of the time. For medieval people, staying clean wasn't about looking presentable. It was about defending the body from invisible forces, navigating a world where disease moved with the wind, and where a smell could mark the difference between health and death. When the Black Death struck Europe in 1347, it moved faster than anyone could comprehend. Within 5 years, the plague had killed an estimated 1/3 of the continent's population. Cities like Florence, London, and Paris were devastated. Streets were quieted by death, trade slowed to a crawl, and daily life was swallowed by fear. Amid the panic, one public institution came under particular suspicion: the bathhouse. For centuries, communal bathhouses had been common across Europe. From Nuremberg to Naples, these establishments offered hot water, steam rooms, and spaces where people gathered to bathe, socialize, and even eat. Cleanliness had been tied to social ritual, health, and religious practice. But after 1347, something shifted. Medical knowledge at the time offered few answers. The prevailing theory was miasma, that disease traveled through corrupted air. Physicians believed that heat opened the pores, making the body more vulnerable to the toxic vapors believed to cause illness. Bathhouses, with their enclosed steam, shared towels, and warm water, were now seen not as places of health, but of risk. Rather than preventing disease, they were suspected of spreading it. Authorities began closing public bathhouses. In some regions, they were shuttered by law. In others, fear kept the public away. The same facilities that had once been associated with purification now became symbols of contagion. In places like Strasbourg and Basel, bathhouses that had served the population for generations fell into disuse. Even in cities that kept them open, attendance dropped sharply. The fear of the body intensified. Bathing, once encouraged for health and spiritual readiness, came to be seen as immodest, indulgent, and even dangerous. Church leaders, already wary of the bathhouses' association with mixed-gender spaces and immoral behavior, leaned into this narrative. Calls for modesty grew louder. Nudity, even in communal hygienic settings, became increasingly condemned. The act of bathing, especially in public, came to be framed not only as physically hazardous, but morally questionable. This wasn't a sudden collapse. Some bathhouses continued to operate into the 15th and 16th centuries, but their role in society changed. They were no longer viewed as civic assets. Instead, they were seen as potential sources of infection or sin. Over time, the loss of public trust and shifting cultural norms led to their decline. The impact was long-lasting. By the time new outbreaks of plague struck in the following centuries, the communal bathhouse was already fading from the urban landscape. Personal hygiene became increasingly private, more limited, and less frequent. The idea that bathing could protect health gave way to the fear that it might invite death. The Black Death did more than kill millions. It reshaped attitudes, severed long-standing traditions, and introduced a new era in which fear of disease outweighed the pursuit of cleanliness. The bathhouse, once a cornerstone of medieval urban life, became another casualty not of infection itself, but of the terror that followed in its wake. In medieval Europe, keeping clean wasn't always about washing the skin, it was often about what touched it. Linen, a fabric made from flax, became central to how people managed personal hygiene without regular bathing. Its role was practical, affordable for many, and deeply embedded in daily life. Linen undergarments, worn closest to the body, acted as a barrier between skin and outer clothing. For men, this often meant a long shirt; for women, a chemise. These garments absorbed sweat, body oils, and dirt. They were easy to wash, quick to dry, and could be laundered far more frequently than heavy wool or dyed fabrics, which were harder to clean and more expensive to maintain. Changing into fresh linen became practice, a form of bodily cleansing. In cities like Paris, London, or Cologne, laundry was a routine task. Public washhouses operated along rivers and canals, while in rural areas, families washed linen by hand using water mixed with ash to create a basic lye solution. Even among peasants, washing linen once a week on Mondays was common, wealthier. Households expanded on this system. Nobles might change linen daily, and servants were assigned to manage wardrobes and laundry. Clean undergarments signaled status and self-control. By contrast, stained or soiled linen implied disorder, laziness, or poverty. Visual cleanliness became as important as actual washing. Medical texts from the period also noted the value of clean linen in preventing disease and odor. Physicians advised changing underclothes regularly, even if the body itself wasn't bathed. It was a strategy rooted in observation, long before the microbial theory of disease. Through linen, medieval people developed a practical workaround. Stay covered, stay dry, and keep the layer that touched the body clean. In a world without plumbing or hot showers, fabric not soaped did most of the daily work. Modern societies often look back at medieval hygiene with ridicule, assuming ignorance. Filth and superstition defined everyday life. But the record tells a different story. Medieval hygiene was not primitive in the way it's often portrayed. It was structured, rational, and adapted to the realities of its time. People washed when water was available, when climate allowed, and when social norms required it. They used linen to protect their skin and absorb dirt. They built baths, practiced communal and ritual washing, and tied cleanliness to moral and spiritual values. Their understanding of disease may not have included bacteria, but it did include observation. They knew that dirt, rot, and foul air often preceded sickness, and they responded accordingly. The mistake is assuming that more knowledge always means more wisdom. Today, with advanced plumbing, soaps, and antiseptics, the mechanics of hygiene are vastly improved, but the cultural judgments about who is clean or dirty still persist, often along lines of class, labor, and access. Much like in the medieval world, cleanliness remains a reflection of resources, habits, and values, not just science. What the Middle Ages offer is a reminder that hygiene is never just biological. It's cultural. It's shaped by belief, economics, infrastructure, and climate. People in the 13th century didn't live in ignorance, they lived within a system that made sense to them. And much of that system, from washing linen to managing waste, was surprisingly effective for its context. Medieval hygiene wasn't about indulgence. It was about survival, discipline, and dignity. Not perfect, but not without reason and understanding. That may say more about our own time than it does about theirs.